Hi, my name is Peter Wu, and I'm a member of the Capital Wing of the Commemorative Air Force based in Culpeper, Virginia. I'm going to be telling you about this 1956 T-34 that I acquired in January of 2015, the adventure I had bringing the airplane back from Central America, and the ongoing restoration project to turn it into a thoroughly modern example of a classic American design. I received my private pilot license in 2002, and I owned a few airplanes before the T-34, including a Piper Cherokee and a Cirrus SR-22, and most recently this beautiful machine, a 1981 Beech 58 P Baron. The P in this case stands for pressurized, and a P Baron is probably the most cost-efficient way to travel with twin-engine redundancy at high altitude. Unfortunately, the price of aviation fuel more than doubled in the time that I owned the airplane, and my mission changed such that I no longer had as frequent a need to make long trips. As such a comfortable, capable aircraft, it was perfect for those trips, but because of the operating cost, I only flew at the minimum necessary to stay proficient, or when I needed to go somewhere, and I never wanted to fly it for fun. So when my usage of the airplane dropped to less than 50 hours a year, I decided to sell it and look for something that would be less expensive to operate and more capable in terms of fun factor. In the 5 years I owned the Baron, I was completely spoiled by the Avionics package, which was almost entirely glass. It featured a Garmin G600 primary flight display, a backup multifunction display, dual GPSs, dual transponders, and full digital engine instrumentation, which allowed me to monitor all the important parameters on the engine continuously and to download the data after every flight. During the same time frame that I owned the Baron, my friend, business partner, and fellow Commemorative Air Force Colonel Jim Cook bought this magnificent North American T-6 Texan, one of the most popular trainers used by the U.S. military in World War II and beyond. Through Jim's generosity, I accumulated many hours in the back and occasionally even the front seat of this rugged tail dragger. Jim exposed me to the challenges and rewards of operating this aircraft type, including the excellent formation training and exhibition opportunities available through the North American Trainer Association. Even before I put the Baron on the market, I made a list of what I wanted in my next airplane, and here's what I came up with. I knew I wanted a warbird because I was really interested in both the historic and preservation aspects. After spending so much time in Jim's T6, I was hooked on the formation part of it, so I wanted a popular warbird that was associated with a strong formation flying community. I also had a strong interest in aerobatics in spite of not having had much experience, so an aircraft type that was certified for ACRA was desirable. And probably most important, it had to be economical to operate. I was routinely burning close to 40 gallons of fuel an hour in the Baron, so I wanted something with dramatically lower fuel consumption and lower maintenance expense. Switching from a turbocharged twin to a normally aspirated single would meet this goal. Although many warbird operators out there have enough money in their airplane budgets for another more practical airplane for cross-country use, I plan for this to be my only aircraft, so it would have to be suitable for the occasional cross-country trip. Most of my trips are to coastal New England, where inclement weather is really common, so I was looking for an airplane that either had or could be upgraded with modern avionics and could fly at night and through rain comfortably. And because of this requirement, I ruled out tailwheel aircraft in general and the T-6 in particular because it's a challenging airplane to land in a stiff crosswind, has high fuel consumption, and a 600 horsepower supercharged engine that can be expensive to maintain. The other problem with the T-6 is it was made for easy maintenance access and short training flights, mainly in warm climates. The result is that the cabin is typically pretty cold in winter, especially in the backseat where my wife sits, and the canopy tends to leak when flying through precipitation, which doesn't do any favors for expensive avionics or passengers. So after some thought and market research to figure out what I could afford, I settled on the Beech Mentor known as the T-34. A friend of mine had one and offered me a ride one day, which included an impromptu aerobatics lesson. I flew the entire flight from takeoff to finish from the back seat, and as far as I could tell, the airplane didn't have any bad manners. So I was hooked. The T-34 is one of Walter Beech's most successful ideas. Following World War II, the high end of the civil aviation market was dominated by two airplanes. The Cessna 195, a traditional radial engine tail dragger with many fabric-covered surfaces, and the all-metal Beechcraft Bonanza, a tricycle gear airplane which quickly developed a good reputation for its harmonious flight controls, and is actually still in production today, almost 70 years later. The T-34 airframe was adapted from the Bonanza, and Walter Beech conceived the Mentor as a replacement for the T-6 Texan, which was still the primary trainer for both the U.S. Navy and the newly established U.S. Air Force. In the post-war letdown in defense spending, there was no request out there for a new trainer, so Walter Beech designed the Mentor entirely on spec, hoping to sell the idea to the military. He conceived the airplane in 1948, and the Air Force took a long time to evaluate the idea, initially requesting just 3 prototypes, and ultimately ordering the aircraft into production in 1953. Production of the T-34B version for the U.S. Navy started in 1955, and the model B-45, essentially a T-34A, was built for export. The type was also built under license in Canada, Japan, and Argentina. Ultimately, total piston engine production of the T-34 was more than 1,900 examples. Unfortunately, Walter Beech never lived to see the success of his design, having died from a heart attack in 1950 at the age of 59. The A and B variants are essentially the same airplane, delivered with the same power plant and identical performance characteristics. The A model was certified in the aerobatic category, used by the U.S. Air Force and produced as the B-45 for export and by licensees. This original design has nose-wheel steering, an adjustable seat that could accommodate pilots of different heights, and an emergency canopy release that jettisoned both canopies when actuated. The Navy ordered their version, the B model, with differential braking, adjustable rudder pedals with a fixed seat, and an emergency canopy opening mechanism actuated by compressed nitrogen. The Navy also wanted a slight increase in wing dihedral and only had the aircraft certified to utility category limits, possibly to limit stress on the airframes. Beech even went on to develop a jet version of the Mentor, also as a private venture in 1955. Both the Air Force and the Navy were interested in transitioning primary training to jets, so they had a competition among the manufacturers. The Air Force ultimately chose the Cessna T-37 Tweet, and the Navy chose an airplane called the Temco TT Pinto. The Air Force stuck with the T-37, but the Navy removed the Pinto from operational service after only 2 years, returning the T-34B for primary training. Only one prototype of the Jet Mentor was ever made, and Beech lost the competition, but test pilots praised the handling characteristics of the type. This airframe still exists, but unfortunately sits outside of the Kansas Aviation Museum. The T-34C, or Charlie model, was a turboprop variant developed at the request of the U.S. Navy in the early 1970s. This is a 4,000-pound airplane that used a Pratt & Whitney PT6 engine derated to 400 shaft horsepower. The type included built-in oxygen and air conditioning and was capable of greater than 200 knot cruise speeds up at altitude. An attack variant called the Dash 1 version was produced for export with 4 hardpoints, and production ran from 1975 to 1990 with a total of 494 examples produced. By the time the production run ended, the T-34 and all its variants was used by governments on 6 continents. The T-34Cs used by the U.S. Navy were only recently replaced by this airplane, the T-6 Texan II, also a Beechcraft product. Members of the T-34 Association were optimistic that the T-34 Charlie models being retired would be made available for sale to private operators, but unfortunately these seemed destined for the scrap heap. So while it would be fantastic to own and operate a T-34 Charlie, it seemed that none were available and probably never would be. So I set out to buy a piston engine T-34. By the time I sold my Baron, I'd been looking at the T-34 market for about 6 months, and I had a pretty good idea of what was out there. Although there were really no significant differences between the A and the B models, I gravitated towards the A's because of the aerobatic category certification, as one of my potential plans for the airplane is to start an unusual attitude recovery course for general aviation pilots, and I wanted to make sure that the full flight envelope was legally available. In the end, I wanted a fully restored airplane with an upgraded engine, modern avionics, and custom paint. Of course, the least expensive route is to find an airplane that already has all these desired mods, but none was available, so I decided to focus on airplanes that already had the most expensive of these, the upgraded engine. I settled on this 1956 T-34A that was listed in the usual places online. It had been produced as a B-45 in 1956 for export and operated by the Chilean Air Force until 1988, when it was retired from service and sold to a civilian operator in the U.S. It had a Continental IO550 engine with under 75 hours since factory remanufacture and a brand new 3-bladed Hartzell prop. This is an expensive mod that cost close to $100,000 by the time the engine and prop are fitted into a heavily modified engine compartment. In addition, this airplane had previously satisfied the wing spar ID and had been returned to the full flight envelope. The methods used for compliance on this airframe are shown here in option E in this diagram provided by the T-34 Association. Now, this is a long technical story that I won't delve into here, but I do want to acknowledge the enormous amount of work that members of the T-34 Association, Earl Parks, the Nogles, George Braley, the FAA, and many others did to preserve the T-34 fleet for future generations. I do want to emphasize that I have full confidence in the wing spars in this airplane. The avionics were basic but functional, and this was actually desirable because I wanted to update both panels with completely modern equipment. And the price of the airplane was really quite reasonable. There was just one problem, and that's that it was located in Panama City, and here I'm talking about the capital of Panama, the country in Central America, and not the coastal town in Florida. The airplane had been purchased by a charter operator there about 2 years previously, and they'd done the engine and prop upgrade in the U.S. The operator had set up a warbird ride business that gave brief rides out over the Panama Canal, including some basic aerobatics for those who were interested. Unfortunately, this failed as a business model, and after about 2 years, the operator decided to cut his losses and sell the airplane. It had been on the market for about 6 months, probably because no one in the target market, the U.S., wanted to go down to Panama to evaluate it and bring it back. Now, I had purchased 3 used aircraft previously, and I'd always followed the same routine. I did my research, I went to see the airplane, and while I was there, I arranged to have the airplane checked by a shop near the seller, usually on the same field, and preferably one with no vested interest in the sale, meaning no prior ongoing relationship with the seller. I then returned home, negotiated over any squawks, completed the purchase transaction, and only returned later to fly the airplane home. But because of the time, distance, and expense involved, I wanted to skip the step where I made the second round trip to the seller. I was planning to do the evaluation, the test flight, negotiation over any squawks, repairs, purchase, familiarization flight, and ferry flight home all in the same trip. I had a week off from work to make this happen, and figuring the ferry flight would take 3 to 4 days, that left me another 5 days to accomplish all the other tasks. To be successful, I was going to have to do a lot of homework and arrange quite a bit of logistics. So here's where I got really lucky. Because the airplane had recently been in the US and had extensive work done, I was able to call Blackwell Aviation, the shop that did the work, and talk to Dan Blackwell, the shop owner who also happens to be a T-34 owner and former president of the T-34 Association. Besides being a great guy, Dan's also one of the most knowledgeable mechanics out there with respect to the aircraft type and the available mods. And what I learned from him was really reassuring about the state of the airplane, because the wings have been inspected for the SMAR mods and the engine and prop are basically new. I figured as long as the airplane hadn't been abused since arriving in Panama, I could feel pretty confident the airplane would be in excellent condition when I arrived. I caught another break when I found an article in the June 2013 issue of the Mentor Monitor, the quarterly publication of the T-34 Association, written by Bill Cherwin, a longtime member who had performed the ferry flight from Blackwell Aviation to the current owner in Panama. And after a lengthy phone conversation with Bill, I felt like I have an even better picture of what was going on with the airplane. One thing that came out of these phone conversations was that the seller, Rafael Barcenas, was the former administrator of the Panamanian FAA, so I concluded my chances of finding an unbiased shop on the field to perform a pre-purchase inspection were probably pretty low. I would have to bring my own mechanic or perform the pre-purchase inspection myself. I've known Adrian Eichhorn for a long time, and currently we're on the same hangar row at Manassas Airport in Virginia. He's an IA with extensive experience working on and a great love of beach bonanzas. He also happens to be an airline pilot, so he can get pretty much anywhere in the world for very little money. Adrian and I collaborated on a project a few years ago to repurpose medical imaging equipment to perform high-definition borescope inspection of piston aircraft cylinders. And Adrian has done extensive research on the visual appearance of both normal and abnormal exhaust valves. This culminated in a poster produced by the AOPA Air Safety Foundation that was sent free of charge to every A&P mechanic on the FAA registry. My only real concern about the airplane was the state of the engine, particularly the exhaust valves, because I wasn't certain how the aircraft had been operated and I knew it hadn't been flown much the past 2 years. The airplane was hangared, but it was in a very humid environment that was perfect for generating corrosion. So as part of the pre-purchase inspection, I really wanted a good look inside the cylinders. The problem with our medical endoscope setup was it wasn't very portable. It certainly wouldn't fit in my carry-on, and it was going to take too long to ship it back and forth to Panama given the delays getting it through customs. So I decided to trade a little bit of resolution in the camera for a lot more portability, buying this $130 USB dental camera from Amazon. This is a 90-degree endoscope that connects to a laptop and provides a fantastic image for the price. It's also the perfect size to fit in a spark plug hole. Adrian originally planned to come along, but given the uncertainty about the amount of time I was going to be in Panama, it was in no way certain that he could get back to work on time. So I decided to go it alone with my dental camera. There weren't too many surprises when I arrived in Panama City. Some of the magnesium control surfaces were lightly corroded, but this is very common in these airplanes. The skins on the elevators and rudders had been replaced in 1999 when the aircraft was painted, and this wasn't a huge surprise. I planned to repaint the airplane anyway, So I knew this could be easily remedied and didn't pose a safety issue for the flight home. The borescope inspection showed that the cylinders and exhaust valves were in perfect condition, and a pre-purchase inspection flight revealed no major issues with the airframe, the power plant, or the avionics. And this was all arranged on a Sunday so that we could work out any discrepancies prior to actually finalizing the sale on Monday morning, so I could start the ferry trip back home as soon as possible. Luckily, the airplane was still registered in the US, but because it was located outside the country, I was going to have a paperwork problem right after the sale was completed. When you purchase an airplane, the seller provides you with FAA Form 8050-2, which serves as a temporary registration certificate until the permanent one arrives, usually several weeks later. One rule about the temporary certificate is that it can't be used to fly the aircraft into or out of the US. This requires the permanent version. In order to receive this permanent document the same day of the sale, Courtesy Aircraft, the broker handling the deal, did a lot of logistics work the week prior to make sure that the title company in Oklahoma City could walk the documents over to the FAA just as soon as the sale was approved. I approved the sale on a Sunday evening, and the title company was there at the FAA registration branch first thing on Monday morning. We knew this would take a few hours for this flytime wire to come through, so Raphael and I took off on a 2-hour familiarization flight so I could get more comfortable with the airplane. It was during this flight that we discovered that the vacuum pump has failed, so as soon as we landed, Raphael had his mechanics right on it, putting a new vacuum pump on the back of the engine. The flytime wire came in right around lunchtime via email, and I printed it out in Raphael's hangar and started the process of heading home. And it was then that I really began to appreciate the civil liberties that we have in the United States. Because in every Central American country, even the shortest local VFR flight requires filing a flight plan, so Raphael took me around to the relevant offices to file the paperwork. Back at the airplane, in anticipation of crossing the U.S. border, I put temporary 12-inch end numbers on the tail made out of blue painter's tape. And I placed an inflatable raft in the rear seat and put a water-activated marine personal locator beacon borrowed from Adrian on the top of the raft. I also had a spot tracking device with PLB features with me in the front cockpit, as well as a self-inflating belt-style personal flotation device strapped around my waist. So we called for fuel, and Raphael showed me his trick for making sure the tanks were fully topped off. The T-34A, as it came from the factory, has 50-gallon fuel tanks. Many have been upgraded with tip tanks or different wings, but this airplane wasn't one of them. For the original engine and training mission of the airplane, this amount of fuel was pretty reasonable, but for me getting home with a thirsty 300 horsepower engine, it was going to mean quite a few fuel stops. So I put my game face on, I made one last stop at the flight plan office to activate my flight plan, and then started up the airplane for the journey home. By now it's about 1:30 in the afternoon, and I had 2,200 nautical miles and about 14 hours of flight time ahead of me. I knew I wasn't going to make it in one day, but I figured I could at least make it to Key West by the end of the second day. I had chosen the route with Raphael's help, which was the exact same route that Bill Sherwin had taken when he brought the airplane down fewer than 2 years before. There was a more direct route available that would have taken me via San Andres, a small island off the east coast of Nicaragua that's actually part of Colombia. The airport there has regularly scheduled airline service, but the availability of 100 low-lead fuel was in question, and calls and emails to the FBO there went unanswered. And given the long overwater flight segments, I decided to take Raphael's advice and go mostly over land. My insurance company had specifically told me they would not cover any accidents or incidents that happened in Cuban airspace, as it was technically illegal for a U.S.-registered aircraft to fly over Cuba, even though U.S. air carriers did it every day en route to and from the Caribbean and South America. So I briefly contemplated taking the long way around, stopping in Cozumel, then flying up the east coast of Mexico, and then home via Texas in the southeast U.S., but Raphael's stories of high fines and bureaucratic headaches in Mexico convinced me to accept the risk of a 45-minute flight over Cuban airspace. I figured by the time I got to Grand Cayman, I would have a pretty good idea of my level of confidence in the airplane, and I could always turn back to Mexico if it didn't feel right. One thing that was clear is that it was going to be impossible to go from Grand Cayman to Key West without overflying Cuban airspace because the route would have exceeded the fuel range of the airplane. So the first leg took me from Panama City to Liberia on the west coast of Costa Rica. The airport was chosen over San Jose because it has a new terminal, a long runway, it's at sea level, has reasonable fees, and is close to inexpensive hotels. Instead of going direct, I filed over the Boca del Toro VOR to stay closer to land. The first leg was uneventful. I had good VFR conditions, or at worst a scattered layer below, and here I am passing the Centennial Bridge over the Panama Canal on departure. I climbed up to 12,500 feet to avoid high terrain in Panama and Costa Rica, and I found some pretty good turbulence on the descent into Liberia. It was a pretty windy day there, but fortunately the wind was right down the runway when I landed. The customs agent who came out to the airplane took time to rap on several panels on the outside of the airplane, presumably to make sure that they weren't loaded with drugs. Convinced that I was okay, I posed for several pictures with the agents and police and had the airplane in the background. Given its proximity to coastal hotels, this airport sees a fair amount of private aircraft from the US, so I paid about $100 to a handler to take care of all the paperwork. This made it all pretty painless, and I would have been refueled and ready to go in under an hour, but at this point it was close to 5 in the afternoon, and the next leg was also going to be over high terrain, so I elected to stop and spend the night there, thinking I'd get an early start the next day and be in Key West by the afternoon. I figured that the paperwork process would be similar in Honduras and Grand Cayman, and I would have plenty of time. Before leaving Panama, Rafael told me that whatever I did, I should avoid spending the night in Honduras, and this plan would make Honduras the first stop the following day. So it turned out the airport offices didn't open until 8 a.m., and it took a little while to get the paperwork done before I could depart on my next leg to La Ceiba on the north coast of Honduras. Given the coastal location, I was concerned about instrument conditions, so I'd come prepared with instrument approach plates for this and all the other stops along the route. Rafael, who'd used the airport many times, had assured me that I didn't need it because it was always VFR there. The leg started off with some beautiful views of the Costa Rican coastline and took me over Managua, the capital of Nicaragua, and the Momotombo volcano. Things didn't really start to get interesting until I was in cruise at 11,000 feet, talking to Content Control, the approach control over Tegucigalpa, the capital of Honduras. The frequency wasn't that busy to begin with, and over about 20 minutes the transmissions became less frequent and more scratchy, to the point that there was nothing on there at all. I asked for a radio check and got no response, so figuring I had missed a handoff, I looked at my low-altitude en route and started dialing up various other frequencies in the area, all with no response. At the same time that I was dealing with this problem, the weather was getting worse. A scattered layer had changed to broken and then was completely overcast below. I was still in the clear above, but I was starting to wonder about how I was going to get down, and looking at the low-altitude en route chart didn't make me feel any better. There was plenty of high terrain all around, and as you can see by the minimum en routes on these altitudes, they're all at least 10,000 feet. Luckily, when I got closer to destination, the overcast layer opened up to broken and presented the choice of several holes through which to descend. I was able to talk to the tower at La Ceiba about 10 miles out once I got around the high mountains to the south of the airport. This picture was taken shortly after I landed at Golosón, the airport in La Ceiba, where it's supposedly always VFR. I had just come from those mountains behind the airplane, and believe it or not, it was all legitimately VFR throughout the descent, although I was really happy to have the terrain features in the ForeFlight app on my iPad to reassure me that I was headed through the safest hole. On first glance, Golosón seemed like a place where airplanes went to die. There were dilapidated civil and military airplanes of all shapes and sizes scattered around the ramps, and even more airframes in more advanced states of decay further off the ramp on grassy spaces. The staff at the airport was friendly and helpful, but it was clear that they didn't deal with U.S. registered aircraft as transients very often. What happened next was a seemingly endless round of bureaucratic maneuvers, going from one office to another to pay fees and fill out paperwork in person. This was almost entirely conducted in Spanish, which I fortunately speak well enough to carry out these kind of transactions. If I hadn't, the airplane might still be there. The Hondurans didn't seem so much interested in the drug-carrying capability of the airplane as its potential to carry insects, so the airplane got sprayed with a disinfectant, and I was also charged for an agricultural inspection. And I paid my fuel bill, and by the time I filed my flight plan, it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'd cleared customs, and I was walking out to pre-flight the airplane, and one of the airport officials asked if I had a landing permit for Grand Cayman. When I replied no, I didn't think I needed one. They replied that I definitely needed one, otherwise I would face heavy fines when I landed. This same official had absolutely no idea how to request the landing permit, so I cleared customs again, went back into Honduras, and went about trying to figure this out. I eventually approached the dispatch desk of an airline that flew between the two countries. The dispatcher there didn't know, but she did have the phone number of the Civil Aviation Authority in Grand Cayman. And after a few calls, I was able to confirm that Grand Cayman did not now and never had any requirement for a landing permit for light civil aircraft from the U.S. This distraction had cost me another hour, and I was facing a 2.5-hour flight almost entirely over water, the last half of which would take place after dark. So I made the decision to stay the night in Honduras, where I'd been advised not to spend the night. It turned out okay after the airport staff recommended a quiet, secure place just 5 minutes down the road. The next day I woke up to beautiful VFR conditions. The airport staff again didn't arrive till close to 8 a.m. and I had to repeat a number of the same bureaucratic steps that I'd done the day before, but at least this time I knew what was required and it all went a lot more smoothly. And I eventually took off for Grand Cayman, snapping this picture of the La Ceiba Marina on departure. Once up at my cruise altitude of 11,500 feet, I trued out at 167 knots on 13 gallons an hour of fuel. And that gave me a comfortable fuel reserve of over an hour on arrival in Grand Cayman. I was going to be spending the next 2.5 hours looking at the ocean from a front seat of a single-engine propeller aircraft, and there wasn't much to do besides take pictures of the clouds and listen to the engine, which always sounds a little rougher in situations like this. Looking at my low-altitude en route, I saw that almost exactly halfway along the route was a waypoint called Cisne, which seemed to be an intersection defined by several distant VORs. So I was very surprised when I reached this point to find this small group of islands and noted a runway on the largest one. Using the nearest feature on my panel-mounted GPS, I discovered that this was a 4,600-foot-long runway that appeared unattended. Luckily, I never even contemplated using it, but it was nice to know that I turned out to have an emergency divert field exactly halfway through my longest overwater leg. The rest of the leg was uneventful, and I had a nice view of the cruise ships moored in Georgetown as I arrived in Grand Cayman. Customs and flight planning were very efficient, and I was underway in a little over an hour, including fuel and lunch. I had to change my Cuban overflight permit because of the delay in Honduras, but this was expertly handled by Jim Parker at Caribbean Flying Adventures. Caribbean Flying Adventures is a great deal. I think it's about $50 a year, and you get one free Cuban overflight permit per year, and if you need more, they're available at very reasonable cost. And Jim Parker knows how to do this and is really happy to help GA pilots trying to fly in this area. Transiting Cuban airspace was actually very easy thanks to polite controllers, and I was really happy to finally hear the words radar contact from Miami Center when I was about 20 miles from Key West. This is a picture of the Cuban coastline, and it's easy to see how this is about to become a very popular tourist destination. There was about a 1,000-foot ceiling in Key West when I arrived, and I was lucky it wasn't any lower because they have no ILS or LPV approaches there, and the RNAV minimums are only about 600 feet. My experience with U.S. Customs was the most efficient on the entire trip. My luggage and I were in and out of their building in under 10 minutes, and a short time later I was parked on their ramp. The overcast layer had cleared, but it was already sunset, so I headed for the hotel and a couple of adult beverages. The remainder of my trip up the East Coast was very conventional, and I arrived home the next evening. There were IFR conditions most of the way home, but it was mostly a thin overcast layer, and I was in the sun for most of it. Luckily, the ceilings weren't too low, because while shooting my first real ILS, I discovered the glide slope receiver, which had been checked and working in Panama, was now inoperative. The database in the panel-mounted GPS reached the limit of its coverage just about 100 miles from home as the sun was setting, and I navigated the rest of the way using VORs and my iPad. So I'm going to be spending the rest of the talk telling you about the restoration and renovation work that I've done to the airplane so far. After I arrived home, I was off to the avionics shop within a week to start redoing the panels. The goals of my avionics project were to install a modern IFR-certified GPS comm unit, modern digital engine instrumentation, comply with the 2020 ADS-B mandate, allow an instructor sitting in the aft cockpit to have full situational awareness, provide USB charging ports in both cockpits, as we've come to rely on so many terrific handheld devices for flying, and finally to eliminate the vacuum system. The FAA has come out in favor of eliminating vacuum systems given the generally poor outcome associated with vacuum failure in instrument conditions. In order to remove the vacuum system, I elected to install a Aspen Electronic 2-screen primary flight display multifunction display combination with reversionary capability and battery backup. In this installation, the screen on the left is primary and the one on the right is secondary and available for reversionary mode, which completely duplicates the primary display. According to the STC for this combination, a third attitude indicator is required as a backup. The large display on the top right is the engine monitor, which allows continuous monitoring of all engine parameters and downloadable telemetry data. The GPS comm unit is a Garmin GTN 750 with integrated NavCom and a remote-mounted transponder. IFR redundancy is provided by a backup NavCom radio and course deviation indicator at the bottom left, and GPS redundancy is provided by an iPad with the iPhone as a third backup. I retained the existing flaps gear indicator and G-meter. The autopilot in the airplane is rate-based, and I was required to retain the 3-inch turn coordinator. Now, I could have mounted it behind the panel, but I actually like having it in view when doing acro because it's easier to look at than the little triangle-rectangle combination at the top of the Aspen PFD. Behind the panel is a Garmin GDL88 ADS-B transceiver, which both reports the aircraft's WASP GPS position to ATC and receives weather and traffic data that's displayed on the large Garmin panel. Headset jacks and USB charging ports are at bottom right. Many of the same principles were used in the aft cockpit. I added another Aspen PFD and installed a mount for an iPad mini, which runs ForeFlight and serves as the multifunction moving map. I also retained the existing flaps gear indicator, G-meter, and turn coordinator. The airplane was at the Avionics shop for about 10 weeks, so I had some time to think about the paint. I did some research on my particular airframe. I knew that it had been operated by the Chilean Air Force as a trainer, but I had also learned that some of the T-34s that they had flown had been fitted with hardpoints for target practice. Although it seemed possible that some Chilean T-34s might have been involved in actual conflict, the truth is the only T-34s that have ever seen conflict were those flown by the Argentinians in the Falklands conflict in the 80s. With the sale of the airplane, I received the complete maintenance records, including logbooks kept by the Chilean military. I knew that the Chilean bureau number was 177 and that they operated it from 1956 to 1988 when the airplane's FAA registration records began. As I wanted to know more about the airplane's history, I wrote to the Chilean Air Force attaché in Washington, who politely replied that they did indeed operate the aircraft, but had purged all the records after selling the airplanes to a private buyer in the U.S. in 1988. The information he supplied conflicted with the dates in my logbooks, but he did mention that some of the airplanes had been painted with camouflage and fitted with rail rocket launchers. The attaché was nice enough to include a large glossy magazine printed for the 100th anniversary of their Air Force that included a few photos of their T-34 fleet in action. None of these photos clearly include my airplane, but they demonstrate the typical paint scheme, which was mostly polished aluminum with a few color accents, including a painted rudder. An internet search revealed some additional photos, including this one showing that the aircraft had also been operated by the Chilean Navy. I was intrigued by the attaché's statement that there were airplanes fitted with rocket launchers, but was unable to find any historical photos of this configuration until I came across a U.S.-registered airplane with the Chilean camouflage scheme. This airplane is November 34 Bravo Victor and was also one of the B-45 models imported back to the U.S. in 1988. So I made contact with the owner, Mark Overholzer, through the T-34 Association. Mark's only the second owner of the airplane since its return to the U.S., and with the aircraft records was a copy of the original sales brochure put out by OK Aviation, the business in California that had imported the 17 airframes. And sure enough, the brochure said that all of these airplanes, including mine, had been fitted with hardpoints, and you can see that in this picture here, just outboard of the right main landing gear. Mark was also kind enough to send along some photos of the cockpits when he purchased the airplane before his avionics upgrade, and those cockpits were very much in stock condition, and this picture shows the armaments panel that was used to launch rockets and drop bombs. And with a little more poking around the internet, I was actually able to find a picture of my airplane when it was still in the Chilean Air Force, and here it is bearing its bureau number 177 on the tail. An interesting historical footnote is that the Chileans replaced their T-34s with a new design of their own, which they called the T-35 Peon. This airplane was built by Piper and shipped as a kit, where it was assembled in Chile. It was based on the Piper Aero, but included a different center section, a wing stressed for aerobatics, and a Lycoming AEIO 540 engine with inverted fuel and oil systems. The Chileans still use the airplane for primary training, and at last count they had 19 in their inventory. I have nothing against the Chileans, but I wasn't in love with either the camouflage or the polished aluminum paint scheme, and with respect to polished aluminum, I didn't have a line staff to keep the airplane looking good. The other problem with polished aluminum is that an airplane is this age has been painted a few times and typically has had many small Bondo repairs, so to convert back to polished aluminum, many skins would have to be replaced, and that sort of restoration project just wasn't in my budget. I briefly flirted with the idea of retaining or enhancing the paint scheme that was already on the airplane, which I had always thought was a one-off, dreamt-up design that was the brainchild of a previous owner. But as it turns out, this scheme did actually have an historic basis. The scheme was thought up by Dale Snodgrass when he was commander of VF-101, which was the last U.S. Navy squadron to operate the F-14 Tomcat before its deactivation. At the time, Captain Snodgrass had the 3 of these Charlie models that were used for currency and ranging purposes, and they were painted in this high-visibility scheme. The thing that always bothered me about this scheme was the invasion stripes, possibly intended to honor D-Day veterans, but somehow in Congress on an aircraft that was built in the 1950s. One scheme that I had always loved was the Navy high visibility scheme that was used on most T-34 Charlie models. I love the color combination, the design, and the graphics, and the truth is I've always had a great interest in the Navy in general and naval aviation in particular. It was clear from the historical record that the commanders of the various Navy training squadrons that operated the T-34B model had broad authority to paint the airplanes in any number of variations on this theme. I didn't feel any particular obligation to paint the airplane in a Chilean scheme, and I love the Navy scheme, and I love the Navy. So I proceeded to work with scheme designers to come up with this scheme, which is based on the T-34 scheme, but updated to a more modern design. I also borrowed heavily from a design they put together with fellow T-34 owner Dave Marco. The Bureau number 168737 is made up and is actually an unused number that comes right after a group of F-35Cs coincidentally delivered to the reactivated VF-101 squadron and a Global Hawk drone. I wanted a number that ended in 737 because of my affection for another airplane, the Boeing 737, and it so happens that I'm working on another restoration project, which is the conversion of a real 737 nose section into a fixed-base simulator located in the basement of my home. But that's the subject of another talk entirely. I can't say enough good things about scheme designers. They design paint schemes for everything from Piper Cubs to corporate jets, and when you've decided on a final scheme, they make these highly detailed drawings for the paint shop. So once the avionics were done, the airplane went off to the paint shop in North Dakota where the old paint was completely stripped. And as expected, we discovered a large number of Bondo repairs. The shop spent over 50 hours of labor filling in all these dents and dings. And after the repairs were made, all the control surfaces, canopies, cowlings, and gear doors were removed so that the base white could be applied. I chose this paint shop in North Dakota based on work done on my previous airplane. This shop specializes in a base coat, clear coat process that's highly labor intensive, made even more so by the number of colors and complexity of the graphics on my airplane. Every single legend was painted on, there aren't any decals, and after painting, the edges were wet sanded to give a smooth finish prior to clear coating. Fortunately, the legends can be purchased as a complete set of paint masks from a company called Aerographics. And after the base white, the orange was added. And then the tedious work of applying all the graphics ensued, and from the time this picture was taken, it was about another month before the paint job was completed, given the time necessary to paint all those graphics, wet sand the edges, clear coat, and reassemble the aircraft. I really couldn't be happier with the result. I have an airshow quality paint job with a design that both honors the generations of Navy and Marine Corps aviators who learned to fly in this aircraft type, as well as highlights the vast capabilities of a classic design when updated with modern equipment. Of the dozens of aircraft types that I've flown, this is my absolute favorite. The airplane is easy to fly, especially in instrument conditions. The seating position is really comfortable, and you just can't beat the view out the bubble canopy. The only other thing I really want to do to the airplane is to restore the interior, which is going to involve some downtime to strip and paint all the interior parts, but we've had so many nice warm flying days this winter that I think that project is just going to have to wait until next year. Here on the East Coast, winter is actually my favorite flying season because the haze disappears and you can really appreciate the landscape. And here I am doing some acro in the first week of January in 2016, and you can see that it's just absolutely beautiful conditions. I want to take a few minutes to thank some of the people who helped me with this project. I'm sure I'm leaving some people out, but it includes my longtime pilot buddies Jim Cook, Adrian Highcorn, and Andy Schwartz. My excellent mechanic Franz DeBlois at DeBlois Aerospace in Gaithersburg, Maryland. All the fine folks from the T-34 Association, including Dan Blackwell, Billy Smith, Bill Cherwin, and Mark Overholzer. Rafael Barcenas, who sold me the airplane, and Darcy Kapke at Courtesy Aircraft for making it such a smooth transaction in spite of the logistical hurdles. I also want to thank Todd Ott at Shenandoah Avionics, Alicia Solzman at Scheme Designers, Dale Cox at Elite Air Center in Hawley, Minnesota for all his advice, and Chad Hansen at Onsite Aviation in Hillsboro, North Dakota for working with me on the paint. And finally, I want to thank my lovely wife, who makes this all possible by tolerating the time, attention, and money that I devote to airplane projects, and she's even brave enough to get in the thing and strap on a parachute, and at the end of the day, that's what makes it all really worthwhile. So thanks so much for your attention, and if you have further interest in the T-34, I highly recommend the T-34 Association's website at t34.com.